makers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the Fed Chair, Jay Powell, cites weakness in the labour market for the change of course on interest rates. Now, the board voted 11-1 for a quarter-point cut. The only dissenter was the new Fed Governor, Stephen Miron, who wanted a bigger cut. Now, Powell said there was no widespread support for such a move.
There wasn't widespread support at all for a 50 basis point cut today. You know, I think we've done very large rate hikes and very large rate cuts in the last 5 years, and you tend to do those at a time when you feel that policy is out of place and needs to move quickly to a new place. That's not at all what I feel certainly now. I feel like our policy has been doing the right thing so far this year.
Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined by Ozan Tarman, of course, Global Macro Vice Chair at Deutsche Bank. Ozan, as always, thank you so much for joining us, especially on the day after the Fed. It was a big Fed meeting because, of course, they can't. But also, he did seem to intimate, Jay Powell, that economic risks are growing, full stop.
Always wonderful to be with you. Also, Champions League Day, you know, after Fed, like you said, Bank of England Day, state visit. Well, you're right. I mean, it was a big day. We moved a lot right afterwards. First, we got a bit excited because they kept their 2 dots. They increased the 2 dots, 2 cuts like markets hoped. Yeah. Some were fearing that they would stay at 1 cut. But then after the presser, a little bit more gloomy. Market didn't like the fact that he really pushed away from the 50. Also, no 50 support from Waller and Bowman like most expected. And he talked down the dots. But overall, like some of the messages we exchanged last night, I think this market reaction, this very morning, is the right one. I think we're on the right path. Rates are falling. Dollar continues to soften. And equities rip.
But, Ozan, I mean, markets didn't like the fact that Jay Powell basically said that there will be difficult face-offs, right, or trade-offs in the coming months as they consider whether to keep cutting rates. Why was the market surprised by this?
I think they want a little bit more clarity. I think in a way, he almost didn't commit to October, whereas from the dot plots to market's own thinking, market at least wants 25, 25, 25. In my mind, even a 50 wouldn't really shock this time around. There were no weekend news beforehand. But if they saw the numbers in June, after the revisions, if they saw the numbers in July, nobody would push them away from cutting rates by 50. So market wants to see a little bit clarity, a little bit less uncertainty. But despite that, they like the path we're going.
So what you're telling me is that they're overlooking inflation. I mean, this is a thing that Jay Powell, and the fact that there was a consensus, right, seems to have been a victory for the chair. But is the market overlooking the fact that the path for inflation could be quite uncertain?
Overlooking and getting used to the fact that we simply do not touch 2%. I mean, if we have to discuss whether 2% or 3% should be the magic number, you should give me a whole hour show. But at the moment, we're a bit used to sticking right around 3%, 2.9 for CPI, 2.6 for core. If anything, PCE core will come out at 20 basis points this month. If you analyze it, we're quite near the path. What most of the market is getting surprised at is the calmness on the long ends. In summer, like even when I came here in July, what did we expect? A big fall sell-off on the long ends. Trust moments in all 4 big countries at the same time. Led by US, we're getting just the opposite. Long end US rallied 40 basis points.
Yeah, Ozan, when you look at, for example, you know, the jobs report revealed that, the job market had dramatically slowed. Again, how does the market interpret that? Dollar has been quite weak. Does it continue on that path?
On the dollar, yes is the answer, quick answer, but a big debate is going on. Since mostly May, June, we've been a bit stuck at 1.17. Every now and then, my fast money hedge fund friends want to see if there can be a bit of a squeeze on the dollar. But then 2 NFPs, like you discussed, on top Dovish, Jackson Hole, all help the soft dollar trade. Now, my partner in success, George Serados, wrote an important research piece this very week because everybody in the world is buying NVIDIA, Microsoft, Meta. What they do with their dollars is key. If they start buying those NVIDIAs hedged, then the equation changed. And in our research piece looking at the flows, he claims almost 80% is now getting hedged. that paves the way a bit for 120. And France in trade is now, compared to when I met you in July, much emptier. Long euro trade is much emptier. The crowded one was the steepener. Everybody and their brother had the steepener on. Long and US rally didn't help. People relied on euro steepener more. That also started shaking a little bit last week.
Ozan, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Ozan Tarman, their Global Macro Vice Chair at Deutsche Bank. Now, Donald Trump's UK state visit will move from royal spectacle to politics today, with Keir Starmer set to host the president at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country estate. US and UK officials have said they expect to roll out economic deals worth billions of dollars to coincide with the visit. Now, Trump spoke about the bond between the two countries during his speech at a state banquet hosted by King Charles last night.
Today, I believe we're the hottest country anywhere in the world. In fact, nobody's even questioning it, but we owe so much of that to you and the footing that you gave us when we started.
In 2 world wars, we fought together to defeat the forces of tyranny. Today, as tyranny once again threatens Europe, we and our allies stand together in support of Ukraine to deter aggression and secure peace.
Let's bring in our Lizzie Burden, our UK correspondent, who is at Windsor Castle. So, Lizzie, what were the highlights from last night's state banquet and the King's speech?
Well, you heard there from the President and from the King, but also in attendance around that table, you had some of the biggest names of Wall Street and Silicon Valley, the likes of Citigroup's Jane Fraser, Apple's Tim Cook, Nvidia's Jensen Huang, Rupert Murdoch as well. They dined on organic Norfolk chicken, a new specially made cocktail that had been designed especially for the occasion, this transatlantic whiskey sour. And Fran, I knew that you'd be interested in the fashion, so I had a look at what the Princess of Wales was wearing, and it was a couture gown by the British designer Philippa Leslie. So all the lavish details on display. You heard there some of the speeches. The King very keen to emphasise the need for both the US and the UK to defend both Ukraine and the environment. So really hitting on some of the fault lines between the two countries at the moment. It's notable because, of course, this dinner was designed to curry favour with the President, but the King not afraid to speak his mind and pushing on that. So quite different from the historical tradition of restraint from the monarch.
Yeah, they were surrounded by many chief executives. Are we going to have deals today?
That's the hope that the soft power translates into them spending money here in Britain. And the expectation set by Starmer's government is that it'll be a record amount of investment, £150 billion of investment during the visit. The lion's share actually from Blackstone, and Steve Schwarzman was around the table as well last night. The expectation is that that'll translate into 7,600 jobs. And really, it's a crucial moment for Britain to get that growth. The top priority, of course, of Keir Starmer's government. Now, it's not all a one-way street. You've also got UK investment going into the US. The likes of GSK pledging £22 billion into US pharma R&D and manufacturing. Also commitments from the likes of BP and Sage. So that's the business. And then we come to the geopolitics. So Starmer himself will be really pressing the President today, taking up the mantle when it comes to Ukraine, also trying to improve the trade deal between the US and the UK. Of course, we were front of the queue, and Donald Trump, before he got on Air Force One, saying that there's room to negotiate. So let's see where that wiggle room is. But what I don't expect to come up, at least from themselves in the press conference, would be the Middle East. Starmer, the Times of London reporting, is going to recognise formally Palestine as a state at the weekend. And that is, of course, after Trump has left, but before the UN General Assembly in New York next week. The idea being that it would try to avoid a diplomatic incident. But nonetheless, it may hang over the press conference, as may questions about Jeffrey Epstein, because, of course, the UK lost its ambassador to Washington, Peter Mandelson, over the late financier, sex offender, and he really hangs over all of this as the elephant in the room.
Lizzie, thank you so much. Lizzie Burden there at Windsor. Now, Disney's ABC network has taken Jimmy Kimmel's late night show off air indefinitely after backlash over his comments about the killing of Republican activist Charlie Kirk. In his monologue on Monday's show, Kimmel accused, quote, the MAGA gang of using Kirk's death to criticize their opponents. A major owner of ABC TV affiliates, Nexstar Media, had called Kimmel's remarks offensive and insensitive. For more, we're joined by our Ros Matheson. Ros, is his removal politically motivated?
Well, as you were saying, these comments that he made in his monologue on Monday about Charlie Kirk drew a backlash from conservative commentators and from there the administration itself. So you had the communications commissioner, Brendan Carr, saying, that he felt that there was a case to be made not just against Kimmel, but also against Disney and ABC. And of course, the FCC has the levers of licensing for TV stations, including the ABC in the US. And from there, we had Nexstar, which is the largest owner of local TV stations in the US, saying it was going to take the show off air. And subsequently, Disney then put out a statement saying that they were going to take Kimmel off air entirely, at least for now. And so you can draw a line between the criticism that came from the conservative quarters, the administration, and this result, which is that Jimmy Kimmel's show is currently going to be off air. In fact, one other station owner is going to replace it later this week with a special around Charlie Kirk. And so certainly you can see the rapid backlash that came from those comments that he made just a few nights ago.
Ros, is the Trump administration going after media, entertainment, or news for those who go against him?
Well, certainly there's a pattern here. And Donald Trump announced this week he was going to sue the New York Times for $15 billion. He accuses the New York Times of being a mouthpiece of the Democrats, and the New York Times is going to fight that lawsuit. The Wall Street Journal is also being sued by Donald Trump at the moment because of reporting over his ties to the disgraced deceased sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. He settled other cases last year. These are defamation lawsuits primarily, and it's very unusual to have a sitting US president bring defamation cases against the media, and certainly there's a sense that he's using this as a lever for those who write things or report things that he disagrees with. But more broadly also, he's gone for universities in the US saying that they've not done enough to stamp out anti-Semitic commentary. He tied some of their funding to them changing their behavior. And also he's publicly criticized, famous singers, famous actors who also say things that he disagrees with. And so there's a pattern there. The question is fundamentally, does it do anything to that really key pillar of US society and US politics, which is, that pillar of the freedom of speech?
Ros, we also have a story about Scott Bessent's mortgages. What's that about?
Well, our reporting shows that Scott Bessent, in fact, also took out mortgages on two properties at the same time that were named as a primary residence. Of course, that's the contradiction that the US administration is using to go after the Federal Reserve Governor, Lisa Cook, and try and get her fired. There are some differences also in this. These documents were dating back to 2007. They were both with the same financial institution. They were signed by his lawyer instead, who had power of attorney. And so there's no sense that the institution believed he was going to be using both these residences as his primary place at the same time. However, it just shows the complexity of mortgage documents in the US, because these are lengthy documents. They often have very standard paragraphs in them, and you have to amend those documents on your circumstances. And it's quite easy, therefore, potentially to make a slip. And that's the argument that Lisa Cook is making, is that if this did happen, it was inadvertent and it was a clerical error. And so that's at least the case she's making. But we can see from our own reporting that, in fact, it may have been something similar that Scott Bessent did, albeit some decades ago.
Ros, thanks so much for all of that, Ros Matheson there. Now, coming up, the Bank of England is expected to hold interest rates later today on hold. We speak to Santander's Victoria Clarke about how the market will price it in. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. Now, Tesla redesigning its door handles following a Bloomberg investigation that uncovered incidents of people getting trapped in cars that had lost power. Well, Tesla's design chief told us they're combining the electronic and manual door release mechanisms, which are currently located separately. U.S. regulators have also opened an investigation into this. Now, Meta has launched the first version of its smart glasses with a built-in screen as it seeks to turn the product into a consumer hit. The $799 Ray-Ban display features a screen in the right lens that can show text messages, video calls, direction and maps, and visual results from web searches. The chief executive, Mark Zuckerberg, says the glasses will be a vehicle for what he calls AI superintelligence. And Luca De Meo has shuffled the senior ranks at Gucci as the new chief executive seeks to revive the fortunes of the struggling fashion group. While Francesca Bellettini will become the chief executive of Gucci, Kering's biggest brand. Meanwhile, Jean-Marc Duplaix will keep the role of group chief operating officer. While sales at Gucci have fallen 25% in the first half of the year, with a key measure of profit plunging by more than 50%. And the Bank of England will make a decision on interest rates later today, although the MPC is widely expected to keep the benchmark rate at 4%. Instead, the focus turns to its quantitative tightening program amid concerns that its gilt sales are worsening volatility in the bond market. Well, for more, we're joined by Victoria Clarke, UK Chief Economist at Santander CIB. Victoria, thanks so much for joining us. So what exactly are you expecting for the Bank of England today, but also in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I mean, certainly for today, no real expectation at all that there's going to be any action on the bank rate front. So that stays at 4%. The focus is obviously on this quantitative tightening announcement. What will be the total number? We expect, as I think most people do, that the bank's going to rein in the total announcement there. We're looking for £75 billion, which I think is within the sort of ranges that many economists are talking about. But alongside that, big question there is, will the Bank of England feel some of the pressure that's been there in the markets and discussed quite widely to do something to rein in the amount of long sales that they do? And on our front, actually, our sense is that the bank will be quite principled and not lean in too much to that.
Victoria, how do you see inflation developing?
So inflation is the big thing for me at the moment. I mean, if there's one thing that I'm losing sleep over, it's the stickiness of the inflation numbers. So we got 3.8% yesterday. I think we'll push CPI to above 4 next month, as the Bank of England also thinks. And I see it really pretty sticky, actually, right through to year end. I mean, it's going to be fairly close to 4% as we close the year off. This is not a good picture. And I fully recognise that there's some administered prices that are driving this. But beyond that, beneath the surface, it's not a good picture. And on our forecast, actually, CPI is only back at 3 next summer. That is not a picture where the Bank of England can afford not to focus on CPI. And so for today's Bank of England decision, I'm actually looking to see whether they start to shift their focus to putting a bit more weight on inflation over the labour market picture.
Victoria, why do you think inflation is actually so sticky? And we've tried to, last time we caught up with Governor Bailey, it was try to understand how much of this is external factors, so it's trade and tariffs, but how much of it is actually some of the announcements from the Labour government?
Yeah, so the UK inflation picture is, it's a complicated one, as these things always are. There's definitely an administered price element to it. Mm-hmm. Announcements that came earlier in the year on all sorts of things, student fees, you've got, council tax went up a lot, water bills. There was the sort of labour cost change that came from the living wage. I think none of that helps the picture. And then, there is also something about UK inflation which is, pretty awkward in the sense that we have indexation there. So, people ask me, why have you pushed up your forecasts for next April? And I say, well, because I pushed up my forecast for Q3. And, we're hearing, already talk of the pension uplifts being, nearly 5% for next spring. So we cook in a lot of our inflation. It makes it quite difficult when you're away from 2% to get inflation back to it.
Is there anything that could be announced in the budget that could help?
So one of the things that's being talked about at the moment is taking away the VAT, so taking VAT on energy bills down to 0. I think that would help. That would knock about 15 basis points off headline CPI. It's
not huge. So, it's a little bit, but we're
right. It's better, but also the Bank of England might say, well, look, there's also perhaps a demand response from that as well. So the impact, I don't think, for the policy deliberation from that is huge. More fundamentally, I think, the budget should really be looking at what more can be done to boost the supply side of the economy and make sure that we're getting, people into work, and that the incentives to increase output on the, production side of the economy are better. And I actually think for UK inflation, that would be the much more constructive thing to do than tinkering around with little changes.
Victoria, I mean, all of this, I think, means that you've basically changed your interest rate call for the Bank of England, which is keeping it steady.
Absolutely, yes. So steady today, but steady for the foreseeable future, because I just think with inflation where it is at the moment, and actually some hints of stabilisation in the labour market, inflation's the place to focus. I mean, I would still say I think that the path for rates probably is down, but it's well into the distant future now. So certainly nothing that I can kind of see there on the 6 to 9 month horizon. So I think for now the bank is done. Looking at the back end of next year, when we get past that 3% CPI, the economy will have had restrictive rates for a little bit longer, but in my view, not that restrictive, actually. And then I think possibly in the back end of next year, there's a debate to be had about whether they can get cutting again. But my view for the moment is essentially that they are done.
Is there anything, so because we have the president in town and we're expecting some deals, I mean, a lot of these deals usually have big numbers. They're way in the future, so it's very difficult to have a thing tangible, and things can always change. But does it change the prospects for the UK economy at all? Does it make it more attractive for an investment destination?
I mean, I think this is all important, right? The UK-US relationship is important. Actually, to me, the kind of least problematic bit of the UK economy story at the moment is the growth story, which has just been kind of bumping along. It's not too hot, it's not too cold. And I think, these sorts of announcements are important. But what's been quite important for the UK is we're a very services sector heavy economy, 80% of the economy with that. We've been hit less with tariffs because of that US relationship having gone well so far. So I think that that's left the UK, as an international investment destination in a relative sweet spot. And actually, that is probably helping. I mean, the one bit of the economy that's doing relatively well, and I say relatively, is the services sector. So it's important not to underplay it, but also, like you say, this is not going to change the narrative overnight. These are things that build up over time.
I mean, given what we heard from Jay Powell yesterday, does that I know that the Bank of England will push back against this, but US policy has to kind of have an implication on the UK. So how do you see that read across?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So for me, if the Fed's going to be doing more to support its own economy, the bank will look at it through that lens. And so, if the US economy, and you saw the US growth forecasts were upgraded by the Fed last night, I mean, all of these things actually probably reduce the need for the BOE to come in and ease rates. It's just, shoring up a very significant kind of UK export partner. So that is important. There's a discussion to be had about which way, the pound's going to move if the Fed moves more aggressive. I think that's important too. But fundamentally, the Bank of England, again, will be quite principled. I think if there's any sort of sense that the Fed's moving not for pure economic reasons, the bank will say, look, we hold our ground as tough as we can and show that we respond to the data. Victoria, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Victoria Clarke there, UK Chief Economist at Santander CIB. Coming up, as US tech giants invest big in the UK, we'll discuss the AI and technology landscape with George Lee from Goldman Sachs. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. Stocks rise after the Fed cuts rates, even as questions do linger over the pace of future easing. The Bank of England is next. It's expected to hold rates steady, but rate in QT amid concern that gilt sales are worsening volatility. Plus, from pomp to politics, President Trump's UK state visit turns to tougher diplomatic talks on trade and foreign policy with the Prime Minister Keir Starmer today. So Microsoft, OpenAI, and other American companies have announced plans to spend tens of billions of dollars on technology infrastructure in the UK. It's part of a series of business deals that really coincide with President Trump's state visit. It comes as Washington aims to speed up the development of AI in the US, while the UK aims to position itself as a leading tech investment destination. We'll ask to discuss with George Lee. He's co-head of the Goldman Sachs Global Institute. George, thank you so much for coming on. Look, there's a
lot of talk about AI, how fast businesses will adopt it, how maybe we're overestimating the pace of adoption. Like, how are you seeing it? What are the AI implications on businesses, short, medium, and longer term?
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I mean, I think we have to recall this technology is relatively new. The intellectual roots of it trace only back to 2017. The launch of ChatGPT is less than 3 years ago. And it's a novel technology. It's still developing. It has enormous potential in the enterprise. But as you and I were discussing before we came on here, our consumer habits change very quickly in terms of how we adopt new technology. The enterprise is just always slower, more deliberate. There's infrastructure we have to build. There's security concerns we have to address. There are suitability concerns we have to address, especially as a regulated financial institution. I'm incredibly optimistic about the transformational potential in businesses. It's just, you know, my history with technology, it's going to take a little bit longer than we'd hoped. I feel like we are inflecting upward a bit, but I just think we have to be patient.
George, what are your clients saying? What are they worried about, and what are they optimistic about?
I think they are anxious to harvest the benefits of the technology. Again, they see how it influences their personal lives, and they're inventing use cases for the technology. I mean, one of the things we also have to remember, this is a general purpose technology, almost in a way like electricity or a phone or PCs. And so the bounds of its value in the enterprise, it's really constrained by human imagination, by habit change. And so I think people are very excited. Intuitively, it feels like this should be transformational, but it's going to take time to invent, bake in, and harvest the value of new applications.
But does it mean the workforce changes completely? So even how we recruit and the skills we need will change?
Yeah, I think there's fascinating and untold stories about how that will all play out. I'm personally a believer this technology is principally a tool to elevate the creativity and impact of humans. And so I think that's going to have a profound effect. I think it's going to cause us all to need to experiment with, build skills and facility with using the technology. And I'm also fond of saying that I think this technology wave represents a little bit of a revenge of the liberal arts. So all of the skills you gain in classical liberal arts and science education, critical thinking, influence, persuasion, all of that, I think, is going to be really key critical thinking, really key to leveraging this technology. And so folks who have that background, I'm a huge advocate for STEM education, don't get me wrong, but I think those skills are going to be critical with this new tool. George,
are there people, I mean, I have quite a lot of chief executives that, you know, off the record will say, I understand it, I want to understand it as much as I can, but I don't really, know what it will do to my institution. Is this going to be a watershed moment where, you could have Kodak companies that were great and suddenly just are not keeping up with the new technology?
I think that is a source of anxiety for CEOs, which is, the use case and the value of the technology in the enterprise is inflecting upward. It's not manifest except in certain limited cases, maybe in coding, engineering, and customer support. And yet people, just the very questions you're asking, what does it mean for the shape of my workforce? What does it mean for my financial profile? When, how, and where shall I invest the money to harvest this value? I think these are big questions. I think the keenest CEOs are viewing it as a journey. They're trying to build lots of adaptivity and agility into their enterprises. And by the way, they're experimenting with the technology a lot themselves. There's no substitute to weighing in, rolling up your sleeves, and playing with this stuff to develop that intuition about where it's going to be useful.
What role will Europe play in the AI race?
Well, as you were saying in the preamble, enormous amount of activity here in the UK with inbound investment from big United States-based companies. I think that's a ratification and expression of the centrality of the UK, its position as a landing spot to deliver services across Europe, but also just the importance of this market, the potential, the scale of economic activity, the prominence of companies here. And so I think it's critical that these investments need to be made so that companies around the world can have a real presence here in the UK.
But is there a danger that actually Europe over-regulates before understanding the full benefit of, the innovation that AI could bring?
I think policymakers and politicians are wary about a powerful new technology emerging. There's a sense that previous technology waves we sought to regulate after the horse was already out of the barn. And so there's a desire to get ahead of that. And I admire it. I think these are very good faith efforts. I think these inbound investments suggest that notwithstanding a steeper regulatory climb in the UK and in Europe, it's still really important these investments will get made.
I mean, when you look at the, infrastructure implications, but also the energy use, this is a big concern in Europe because of their push also towards renewable energy. How do you solve that equation?
Yeah, it's an unanswered question here, but also in the U.S., which is, one truism of this technology. It's extremely dense and power consumptive, and the scale of some of these data centers we're talking about are really unprecedented. They require continuous, dispatchable, clean power to be delivered to drive these. And in the United States, we're going to struggle to meet that moment of marshaling enough generation, transmission, and deployment of novel technologies. The situation's the same here. And I think it's an unanswered question. It's going to require a lot of capital. It's going to require a lot of policy cooperation and a lot of innovation. And in some ways, that's a real positive, because I think the companies that are going to drive the need for this energy are innovative. They have clean energy commitments they've made.
Yeah.
And so it may drive more innovation in a space that's been relatively flat. Dormant is exactly the right word. Thank you.
George, thank you so much for joining us. George Lee with a very nuanced and comprehensive, of course, analysis of what AI could do in enterprise, co-head of Goldman Sachs Global Institute. Now, over the last few years, Poland has become an economic powerhouse in the European Union. Despite its proximity to the war in Ukraine, Poland has the fastest growing economy and the strongest emerging market currency in the bloc. Now, for more, we're joined by Matt Winkler, our editor-in-chief emeritus of Bloomberg News. Matt, so good to speak to you. It was a great column trying to understand how Poland's economy is really defying some of the threats coming from Vladimir Putin. So what do you put Poland's economic renaissance down to?
Say that Poland is one of the oldest countries, and you could also say that it's one of the youngest countries, because its rebirth, if you will, begins after the Cold War, and more recently in 2004 as a member of the EU. It has been the best performing economy since 1990, when the Cold War ended in Europe. And more recently, since that dreaded event called Brexit in 2016, at least that's when the referendum was, Poland has done something that actually it has never done before. It has grown consistently. If economists' estimates are to be believed accurate through 27, it will grow 11 consecutive years. It's never done that before. And its GDP is, without a doubt, the juggernaut of Europe. But it's not just GDP we're talking about. It's the debt you referenced. Poland's debt is outperforming debt in every other country in the EU or the emerging market. And the currency, as of yesterday, is having its best performance this year since 2018. And the stock market in Poland is right now number 6 among 46 major equity markets in the world. And that's saying a lot, actually, when you think about it, because there's not much tech here. What there is a robust financial sector, and it is proving to be quite formidable. And so all those things together make Poland a bulwark. And of course, it's right on the border of Ukraine. It's the biggest defender of Ukraine at this point. And of course, it is the bulwark against Russia.
So, Matt, what else are markets actually showing us about Poland?
Well, this week, and this is something that wasn't in the column that we published earlier, if you look at what has happened with the exchange-traded fund, the biggest one, the MSCI exchange-traded fund that invests in Poland, the largest investor in the world, starting from zero in the second quarter, purchased more than 900,000 shares in Poland. And that tells you a lot. And they, by the way, had a lot of company this week. We see Jane Street, we see Toronto Dominion Bank, and Oppenheimer all joining BlackRock in that enthusiasm for Poland as reflected in the ETF. There's something else also that's going on. People were somewhat concerned about a credit watch just a couple of weeks ago about Poland, given that its fiscal situation is becoming more stressed. Having said all that, if you look at credit default swaps on the Bloomberg, they'll show you that actually there is zero anxiety where you would expect there to be. So if the people with the most at stake matter at all, and those are the investors around the world, they're showing nothing but confidence in Poland.
And Matt, you also argue that basically Poland's economy is defying all of these threats from Vladimir Putin.
Well, what's interesting is that Poland really is the avatar of what the common market was meant to be. It's all about the free movement of goods and services, where trade is something that all of the member states believe in with each other, and they benefit from each other. And unlike the UK, which has left the EU, Poland actually has benefited from what you would call a reverse brain drain. Much of the new century, we heard and read media reports about the so-called Polish plumber, who was somehow a threat to the European economy. Well, in fact, that was never true. And in fact, those people who left Poland a decade ago or more have come back, and they've reinvigorated the GDP of the country.
Matt, thank you so much, of course, for this story and for coming on TV. Matt Winkler, editor-in-chief emeritus of Bloomberg News. Now, the European Union has agreed to start negotiations with Canada and the UK to give them access to the bloc's €150 billion defence fund. Now, this will allow British and Canadian companies to participate in common procurements financed by the Security Action for Europe programme. The SAFE programme is part of the EU's efforts to boost its defence readiness following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Now, Israeli troops have been pushing deeper into Gaza City as more people flee the devastated area. Palestinians say the strikes have cut off phone and internet services, making it harder for people to call ambulances during the new Israeli offensive. While local health officials say the Palestinian death toll has now surpassed 65,000 people. Israel says it's launched what it calls an intensive military operation towards the heart of Gaza City to confront Hamas. Several nations, including governments in Europe and the Arab world, are calling on Israel to halt its plans, saying the offensive will lead to more suffering for Palestinian civilians. Meanwhile, France says it will use the annual United Nations General Assembly in New York on Monday as a platform to become the first member of an advanced economy to recognize an independent Palestine alongside Israel. Now, several Asian countries, as well as the UK and Canada, may also do the same. But the reality on the ground in Palestinian territories is different. And for many, the flurry of diplomacy probably comes too late. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Fadwa Hodali from Bethlehem. Fadwa, you have an important story that everyone should read on the Bloomberg terminal, also on social media, that we're putting out. What does a Palestinian state look like right now?
Well, thanks for having me. A Palestinian state looks now fragmented and swallowed by Israeli settlements, actually. And if you tour the West Bank from the north to the south, to the east to the west, you would see the fast expansion of settlement. Our reporting showed that since the Israel-Hamas war started, development in Area C has grown 5 times faster than in the last 20 years. So this tells you any potential Palestinian state where this would fall. So it's very fragmented. Also, if we want to talk about movement, restrictions, moving from one city to the other, this is very difficult. And not to forget the destructions of the northern West Bank and the refugee camps. We have 40,000 Palestinians been displaced for the last year because of the destructions of the camps, and they had to find shelter in different places. So the situation is very, very complex. So talking about a state, it's very difficult. And the hope is fading away, actually.
So, Fadwa, the Israeli government has categorically rejected a two-state solution. So how realistic is it, especially a couple of days before European nations could be recognizing a Palestinian state? Does that influence the political landscape?
Well, realistically, it's very difficult. Like I said, the hope is fading away. You know, the UN and the international countries and the EU, they're all trying to push a last push for the recognition of the state of Palestine, but actually without stopping the facts on the ground and without a political will, it will be very, very difficult to achieve the state. Talking to citizens, Palestinian citizens, talking to PA officials, this is actually a last hope. If the international community fails to recognize the state and put the state of Palestine and put the pressure on the Israeli government and put the pressure on the allies of the state of Israel to stop what's happening in the West Bank, then the hope is there will be no Palestinian state in the near future.
Fadwa, thank you so much for, of course, your excellent reporting along with the team. It's our big take today. The recognition, the title of our article, Recognition of a Palestinian State Rings Hollow in the West Bank. I urge everyone to go and have a read. Now, unions are also leading widespread protests across France over budget cuts, raising further pressure on the Prime Minister, Sébastien Lecornu. Now, the fiscal plans were proposed by previous Prime Minister François Bayrou, who was forced to resign after losing a confidence vote. The government is under pressure to reduce France's deficit and tackle growing debt. Coming up, the future of paper and stationery in a digital world. We speak to Moleskine's chief executive next, and this is Bloomberg. Back, everyone. Now, in this digital age, does the power of the pen still hold? Well, despite the continued success of Moleskine's traditional notebooks, the luxury stationery manufacturer is embracing the digital era with a range of products, including a digital notepad. Well, the chief executive, Christophe Archaimbault, joins us now. Thank you for joining us. I mean, a lot of people, including myself, are huge stationery fans. So there's not a world in which we think that it ever dies down. But what's your business plan for developing in terms of new products in an increasingly more digital age?
Well, thank you for meeting today. We see a future, and we keep developing product. We keep developing product, being true to our mission. So, like we launched Peanuts, for instance. We launched a new collection with Musée d'Orsay, celebrating the fact that impressionists have been changing the way people were painting, and that's what Moleskine is celebrating. What we want and where we see ourselves, that's why we see a future, is this is the place where by writing down, you will become creative. Okay, so we develop new product. We have what we call Moleskine Smart, and which is a connection between your notebook and your digital tablet. And we keep inventing product that's going to allow the young generation, the loyal Moleskine users, to express themselves. Mm-hmm.
Christophe, when you look at, again, the changing world, how do you see the interaction of digital and writing? Is it for note-taking? Is it for, the agenda? Like, are you seeing how our tastes are changing? Because you must also be impacted by tariffs, so some of your prices are going up.
Yeah, we are. Actually, talking about tariffs, we didn't wait for the tariffs to relook at the way we source, and I think we've been relooking at the supply chain a while ago to make sure that we serve our clients in a better way, and we reduce our carbon footprint. Now, of course, there is an impact, and we're working to minimize it for our clients and for ourselves. Back to what you were saying, do we see a change? In a way, yes, we see a change, because we're living in a world where digital is everywhere. Mm-hmm. And we see now digital is putting a lot of stress on our brains. Mm-hmm. And writing with a good old pen on paper is a way to detox, is a way to reconnect with yourselves. So we see a lot of the writing, particularly for the young generation, is all about journaling. It's about putting down on paper your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions. So we see a change in the way or what people write, but we don't see the change in the fact that people need to write, okay, more and more.
So how do you make the brand appealing to young people?
We make it appealing to young people, I would say, two different ways. One of the ways we look into is that usually people oppose analog and digital. We don't oppose analog and digital. We believe that they are both sides of one experience. So the product that we're launching, which is this notebook, you call Smart Notebook, where when you write on your notebook, what you write goes on your phone. Because if you walk in a field and you put a dead leaves on your notebook, you will have the smell, you will have the touch, you will have the color. But then you can add in your digital version of your Moleskine notebook the sound, the picture, and those two will be one experience. So what we try to do is to offer to young generation something that is showing them that there is a world next to the digital world that will bring you benefit, because we know that the more you write, the better you read, the better you read, the better you learn. Okay? So that's the way we look at it.
Can you give me a sense of where this works better than other places? So the writing on notepad or on pulp paper, is it more popular in Europe than in Asia than in the US? Or is it actually across the board a similar kind of adoption?
We see similar patterns. Of course, I mean, the Japan and China are probably even more digital than Europe. There is still an habit in Europe of writing. But what we see, particularly among the young generation, is similar. The need of reconnecting, and how a notebook and a pen is a way for you to detach yourself from the digital environment and reconnect for yourself. And that we see that, I would say, everywhere.
What's your biggest challenge in the next 12 months? Have you had to look at different supply chains?
So the supply chain, yes, we're looking into that. Would I say is our biggest challenge? I think our challenge is the point that you were saying, which is how do you make writing relevant to a Gen Z today? And so, of course, supply is part of the work we're doing. But really, we want to be true to our mission. And what we want is to make the people that I was born with a notebook and a pen. The young generation is born with a phone. How do we explain that it's beautiful, it's good for you, and it's fun? So that's really the challenge we see for the next 12 months and probably beyond.
Are you expecting to open any physical stores? Does that make a difference to attracting or converting?
Tremendously. And actually, we're opening in London as we speak. We had the London Design Festival. We're opening a new concept stores in London in a month from now. Physical store for us is important. We have a network of around 65, 80 stores in the world. And that's really the place where you can fully experience what it is to write. So yes, we have a strategy of opening for the next opening stores every year for the next 5 years.
I mean, do you sell more on physical stores or Amazon? Because it's difficult just to acquisition, I guess.
Amazon is still important for us. Yes.
Is there anything, Christophe, that actually gives you, if not hope, gives you, saying, look, this is a business model that will work, because stationery and writing will never leave, even if AI will become bigger and bigger in our lives?
We see it, and actually what is very interesting, now that we are really vocal about our mission and really what we want to see, what is very reassuring for us is the reaction from the consumers. I mean, we are growing across all channels, so there is a traction, there is a demand for Moleskine product. And we just did an event in Japan explaining and showing the beauty of creativity on Moleskine notebook, and it was impressive to see the people coming and really being interested. So what is source of hope for us is really the reaction we see from the people when you say, try, and you will see that it's great. Okay, the response is very positive, and that for us is a source of encouragement. Yes.
And Christophe, thank you so much for joining us. That was the Moleskine Chief Executive, Christophe Archaimbault. Now, up next, we'll have plenty more, of course, throughout the day, not only on markets, but of what's happening in Windsor. Now, the pageantry and the pomp is moving from Windsor to Chequers, where we could have some deals. Then a little bit later on, look, it's up to the Bank of England. It's very clear that we understand the BOE is set to rein in its quantitative tightening program amid concerns that the gilt sales are worsening volatility in the bond market. Up next, a Bloomberg Brief, and this is Bloomberg.